we'll pause a minute here for people to digest the news of late.
Is that for sacrificing?
I think it's because people are like becoming, you know, contemporary preppers, and they're like, you know, they have their 1-bedroom apartment in the middle of Chicago, and they're trying to become self-sufficient. So I think that the other correlation to look at that I haven't, which would be quite interesting, would be hanging hydroponics. I bet that has had a huge uptick in sales as well. Okay, so to get started today, standard kind of intro here at the beginning. There is, if you look at the participants menu, there is an ability to raise your hand. I will try to monitor that as I'm speaking in case you have a question, but also feel free to just pipe up and interrupt me. Today we will briefly talk about a blog post that Mark posted, do a little update on the Refrac simulations that we looked at last week, talk about some of the more advanced ResFrac outputs, and then of course Q&A along and after all those topics. So don't be sheepish about asking a question. So as an introduction to ResFrac, it is a fully integrated, fully coupled hydraulic fracture production and geomechanics simulator. That means it's particularly well suited to maximize economic returns by running sensitivities on your well design. So that could include things like cluster and stage spacing, limited entry, IOR refracking, which we'll talk about today, parent-child interactions, etc. And it also has a broad applicability to multiple asset types. So we'll talk about unconventional today, but it could equally be applied to conventional offshore injection, long-term injection, etc., etc. So the 3 major components of what ResFrac encapsulates into a single model are the hydraulic fracture propagation processes, reservoir flow, as well as geomechanics and how those stresses evolve over time. So if we look at a simulation that will run end to end, this is a parent-child simulation. So we have the parent well fracking on the left-hand side. It's going to go into production immediately. So you'll see pressure drawn down in the fractures, as well as the matrix over a 3-year period. And then we'll go and frac the offsetting child well. And the geomechanical impacts on the rock around that child location have all been honored within the model, as well as the cross flow between wells during that frac hit, and then the production afterwards. So the difference here between other products on the market is that this is all under one umbrella in a single model without starting and stopping, without remeshing or anything else. So us as a company, we license the software on an annual basis to a variety of operators. And then we also perform simulation as a service or turnkey consulting projects. And so we'll leverage our experience from both of these in answering your questions today. Though that experience spans across 2 continents now, both North and South America, across all the major plays. And once again, I forgot to change my title slide. But on the thread of ResFrac, today is designed to be technical. So if you want to ask about commercial aspects of ResFrac, such as licensing the software, please contact me outside of this meeting time, and we can cover it then. Okay, so as Tristan previewed, we wanted to start by just showing quickly a blog post that Mark wrote over the weekend and posted to our website. So if you don't already subscribe to our blog, you can do so by going to our website, clicking blog, and then there is a box to subscribe on the right-hand panel. We try to post more and more frequently now, but probably every 4 to 8 weeks, we'll post something on the blog with increased frequency over the near term, because we have several slated to come out. So Mark's most recent blog post was about how optimal designs change with respect to pricing, and that what was optimal in $60 oil may no longer be optimal at $20 oil or $30 oil. So I'm not going to read the entire blog post, but we'll point to an example that Mark outlines right here, which is on the cost of proppant, that if you could save $400,000 or $500,000 on pumping less proppant, would the reduction in production be worth it on a monetary basis? Because what we're after is the money that we derive from the barrels of oil, not the barrels of oil themselves. So in this case, if we said that reducing 400,000 would result in 10,000 less barrels of cumulative production, should you do it? Neglecting time value of money, at $60 a barrel you would not, but at $30 a barrel you would. So very high level, trivial sort of example. And obviously to do that rigorously, you'd want to complicate the calculation with a variety of other components, such as the time value of money. However, it's a helpful framework in which to think about these problems and some of the opportunities that you might use ResFrac to optimize for. So increasing stage length has been known to reduce well cost, as we published with QEP resources in a paper a couple years ago. Clearly, pumping less proppant or less fluid, or the type of fluid, has potential to save cost, et cetera, et cetera. And those are all sensitivities you can run within ResFrac. I did want to provide a quick update on the Refrac model that we set up last time, and some interesting observations. So this is the Refrac simulation that we set up last week, where we expanded from 1 stage to 2 stages and are refracking. I'm showing cumulative oil in the upper left, pressure distribution in the fractures, as well as the matrix in the upper right, the change in SH min on the lower left, and then the change in stress due to poroelastic effects on the lower right. So I'm going to go ahead and play the video again. So there's the primary frac. Now we're going to go into production, and then we are doing the refrac. So when I watch this model, there is something that stands out to me, and wondering if anyone else sees it. It's really hard when you can't like make eye contact and intimidate people to try to answer your questions. So what I notice here is that the fracture density looks much greater on one side than the other. So if I take another view, we might see what is happening here. So this is just playing the refrac portion. So let's kind of step through and look at what's happening. So here's the condition prior to the refrac. We have evenly spaced fractures, I believe 10 total, because we did 2 5 per stages. And then when there are a couple observations to make. So here's when we start pumping in for the refrac. The yellow dot in the upper left indicates where we are on the scale. And what I plotted was bottom hole pressure versus time. So we have 6 refrac stages. It's approximately cut in half, or it's exactly cut in half. So the first three would be the left hand of the well bore. The second three are the right hand of the well bore. And what we notice is that the first three stages are systematically lower than the next three stages in terms of bottom hole pressure. So what is happening during that time? It's a isolation difference. So if we look at when the refrac is starting, in the pressure plot in the upper right, we can see that the existing fractures are being repressurized and no new fracture forms in this first stage, even though there are 3 perforation locations in which it could. And then similar in the next stage, we actually do see a couple new fractures form, but the existing fracture also repressurizes and starts to grow. And we'll see the same thing in the third stage. And then we can contrast that to the fourth refrac stage, where now I can see that my existing fracture does not repressurize, and I am only injecting into my new perforations. So instead of switching back and forth, I can just tell you exactly what happened here. Is that if you recall in my perforations table, I can put in a activation and shutoff time. So when we expanded the model from one stage, which was originally on the right-hand side, to 2 stages where we added this left-hand portion of the lateral, I did not shut off my existing fractures, or perforations rather, when I started to inject. So what we're actually seeing as this pressure on that first stage is the reactivation pressure for existing fractures. So I know that had been a question last week and something to look at. So we're actually unintentionally looking at it in this simulation, which is this bottom hole pressure up here on the last 3 stages is representative of forming new hydraulic fractures, versus this lowest pressure is reactivating your existing fracture network. And then these ones are kind of in between because we're both forming new fractures as well as propagating the old fracture. So I thought that was an interesting observation. Okay, so there's a question that delta SXX is still positive. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, so we can hear me?
Yep.
I was trying to, whenever you asked us the question of what do you see, I was trying to guess what you're trying to point out was all.
Oh, okay.
Wasn't really a question behind it.
Got it.
I was just observing that that delta S was still like 1,000 pounds after depletion. So that was just an observation.
Yeah, so there are 2 components to that, I think, right? So over here on the left-hand side, this is showing the delta stress due to that aperture change. And so that's some degree of that is going to be locked in. Of course, when you're pumping and the fractures are wide open, it's at a maximum. But even once the fractures close down, there is proppant within that fracture. And so the stress shadow from aperture will never go back to 0 as long as there's proppant that's wedging those walls apart. And so that's what we see in this yellow portion over here, is that along the lateral where you have the most proppant, there is some degree of stress shadow that is locked in. And if I took a slice through a different layer, I would probably find a different distribution, right? So The fact that there is not any yellow over next to these two fractures probably just means the proppant's at a different elevation within that fracture. Then the second component is over here on the right-hand side, which is the stress change due to depletion. So that would be the poroelastic stress change. And here, 0 is kind of is this orange that you see out in broad space. And so this yellow and green and a little bit of blue, that's actually indicating a stress reduction of about 200 to 300 psi, where you've seen drainage or pressure depletion along the fractures. So we are kind of separating out both of those impacts just so you can see which is the dominant one in any instance.
Okay, that's a good explanation. I wasn't aware of the difference in nomenclature there.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we find there are hundreds of different outputs from ResFrac, so it is sometimes useful to go through each of them. Then the other interesting thing I would say, just that I saw here, this is during the refrac when we are repropagating these two existing fractures. You actually see a tensile region form in front of the tip of this fracture as it's extending, which is predicted by the physics and kind of cool to see. So that actually goes negative in front of the fracture tip.
And this is Mark. I'll just quickly add to that also fiber optic observations of offset well crack hits show exactly the same thing as shown in that crack solution, which is a really neat validation of the kind of theory.
So Mark doesn't even know what I had planned, but he just offered a perfect segue.
All right, perfect.
So I received a question this morning on, we have this really great fiber optic data. Can we use it to calibrate or constrain models? And the answer is yes. You just have to turn on a couple of additional outputs to your model, because by default it's not going to output these things. But what I did is, here's that same Refrac model. I put in a line of stress observation points to represent a offsetting well. And I think I have about 30 different points along this well in which I'm measuring stress, displacement, and strain. But just to plot, I picked 3. So we have, this is minus 540, which is going to be the purple lines, minus 300, which will be the orange lines, and then minus 20, which is going to be the green lines. And so at any point in the model, if you specify ahead of time, you can output the change in stress, the change in displacement, as well as the change in strain. And so you can use these data to actually form an actual waterfall plot if you wanted to recreate that waterfall plot through time that you might get if you had, say, a fiber optic strain on an offsetting well. Or you can compare it directly in the graphs like this and compare it to the solution that you're expecting, or the values that you expect. So to set it up, you would go to Output Options in the code, which is where you can specify a variety of additional outputs. And in this table of stress observation points and planes, you would put in a series of points wherever you wanted the code to output the strain and displacement, and then you would just check those in your output file here. And then in doing so, the code will automatically output stress, strain, and displacement at any point that you have specified, such that you can make your own plots like this, or you can actually take this and generate a waterfall plot. Cool. like I said, that was kind of a brief intro today just on some observations here. I'll continue to run some of the other sensitivities that we brainstormed for refracs. And then also just a preview of some of the additional outputs or more advanced outputs that you can generate using ResFrac.
Hey, I'll just make a comment. So you're showing how you're outputting not only stresses, but also strains or displacements. And it's worth briefly thinking about what is the measurement that's actually recorded at a fiber. So a fiber is really measuring displacement at a series of points. And so when they provide a strain rate, what they're doing is they're taking the difference in displacement between 2 points, and that's how they report the strain. But those points are not directly adjacent to each other. It may be that that is like a 30-foot separation. And so when you look at fiber responses, you see an interesting phenomenon where if the fracture is located between the 2 points where you're taking the difference of the displacements, the fracture is opening outwards. And so one point will be going left and the other is going right. And so you actually see the 2 points pushing apart like in tension. And then once the 2 points are all on one side or the other of the fracture, now they're both pushing in the same direction and you see tension. So it's sort of interesting in the fiber responses is that you see this sort of like band of tension that's created really by the resolution of the fiber, not really, it's created by the resolution of the fiber. And then outside of that band of tension is compression. If you were able to have infinite resolution on the fiber, there would always be compression everywhere because any 2 points on either one side of the crack or the other are being compressed. You really have to see tension, you have to have the points on opposite side of the crack. So actually what you can do is you can output displacement with ResFrac, and if you really want to make a true simulation of a waterfall plot as actually measured in the ground, you would look at displacements, and then you would manually, or you'd write a script that would take the difference of those displacements and show what would be the measured strain by the fiber. Alternatively, if you want to just plot like the ideal response, like, well, what if the fiber had infinite resolution, what would this look like? Then you could output strain, and you could just directly plot that up in the waterfall plot style.
Great additions, Mark. So that is the end of the prepared content for today. And so really just opening it up to Q&A or any additional brainstorming on refracs, on how well designs change with oil price, or really anything else that your heart so desires.
Hey, Mark, quick question. Sorry, I was on mute. I was talking to myself. What are you using for material properties when you're calculating strain in the far field in ResFrac?
Well, it's inputted by the user, but it's you know, a Young's modulus, Poisson's ratio, and then you can also put in layering of those, which is not handled in an exact way, but it's handled in a reasonable, approximate way. In fact, I even have some slides summarizing that, and it's in the technical write-up. The most recent version of the technical write-up talks more about that. And you can do an anisotropy of the Young's modulus between horizontal and vertical. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I was just trying to get at whether or not it's using the matrix properties or the 1D submesh method.
Oh, yeah. So the 1D submesh method is used for fluid flow, like the leak off in production. The stress shadowing from the fracture's opening is done in a different way completely. It uses the displacement discontinuity method. The way that works is you mesh only the fractures, and so actually the matrix mesh that you construct has no effect on the stress shadow calculations for crack opening. The mesh that's used to calculate the stress shadow for crack opening is the fracture mesh only, and it doesn't need the matrix mesh to do the calculation.
Well, we can set up another sensitivity on refracs here if there are no questions. So one of the next sensitivity on the list, last time we set up the extend model. This time, or the next one on the list, was what if we bullheaded instead of using a liner. Follow-up question just came on, which was, for fiber data, what exactly are you matching? And so that could be answered in a variety of ways. You know, I think in the projects in which we've had fiber data, it would be overfitting or probably misleading to try to predict that the third fracture on the second well crosses at exactly 12 minutes from the beginning of pumping and does so at a particular strain rate, etc. Instead, what we want to do is extract the high-level learnings from that fiber data and replicate that same pattern or heuristic in the simulation model. So for instance, you might be able to count on a per stage basis how many fractures are crossing your offsetting fiber. So maybe 5 of 8 perforation clusters then cross your observation well. And so when you run the model, you would be tuning the geometries of your fractures such that 5 of the 8 cross on average per stage. Second, we like to look at what the fastest crossing, the average crossing, and the last crossing is, because that tells you something about fracture propagation speed, which ultimately connotes fracture length. So, you know, generally in virgin rock, you would see a somewhat, or what we have seen is a somewhat tighter distribution of fracture crossing times versus maybe in depletion, or if you're crossing a previously fractured well, you might see more variance in fracture crossing times. And so one theory for that would be reactivation of existing fractures, where if I had, say, a third well that was to the upper left, if I fracked that well and it intersected with this existing fracture, it would then be able to cross, and we'd see a strain response on my observation well much faster than on the original well on a per foot basis. So if we are seeing that in the fiber data, we would then try to replicate that in the model as well. So hopefully that gives a little context to how we see the value of fiber data. We've worked on a couple of real interesting data sets where you had multiple wells. And so you can see those fracture crossings on the observation well, and then calculate, you know, fracture propagation velocity, feet per second. And when you have multiple wells, then you get an indication of the scale dependence of that velocity, that the propagation speed is actually slowing as the fracture gets larger. So again, the higher level data or conclusions that we're trying to draw from that, we then impart onto the models.
The question is, there is a concept floating around out there called SRV, where the idea is that there is kind of a region of higher permeability surrounding the hydraulic fractures. And for example, if you use CMG, they create like a template that just sort of sets up simulations like that for you. So the question is, you know, do we handle that in ResFrac? 2 parts to the answer. Yes, it is possible to simulate in ResFrac, and no, I don't recommend it. I'll start with why I don't recommend it. You know, I've seen a lot of data and read a jillion papers and talked to a lot of people, and I honestly don't see evidence to support that as a hypothesis. For example, if you look at the, you know, I go back to the core through studies that were recently published a lot, but neither of them are really showing any indication of kind of stimulation off the hydraulic fractures both the Wolfkamp and the Eagleford core-through studies that have been published in the recent years show a bunch of parallel hydraulic fractures. Most, I think, effectively is the ConocoPhillips project where they had pressure gauges, and what they showed is if you make a cross plot of distance from propped fracture versus pressure, so they had pressure gauges in the offset well after years of production, what they found was it looked just remarkably like a 1 over square root curve, which is what linear flow looks like. And it was linear flow, I don't remember the number, but let's say it was on the order of 100 nanodarcies, which is kind of what we think the permeability is. So what that data showed, and it was a direct observation you could look at, you could see a picture of the fractures, is that there wasn't an SRV. There was propped hydraulic fractures, and then there was fluid just flowing through the rock towards the fractures. Now, it's possible that there are planes of weakness and natural fractures that are contributing to the system permeability. So when I talk about the matrix perm, and generally what we mean in a ResFrac simulation by matrix perm is what's the system perm, the aggregated perm of everything together in that block of rock. And maybe the natural fractures and planes of weakness contribute to that. But there's very, very sparse evidence to support the idea that you're creating a dense kind of system permeability enhancement around the hydraulic fractures. It simply is not observed. It's a hypothesis that hasn't really been borne out by data. That's my personal opinion. Having said that, you can simulate it in ResFrac if you want to. And here's how I would recommend it. So you can define a table of pressure-dependent permeability multipliers, or a table, and that can be reversible or irreversible. So reversible is what we use to kind of accelerate leak off during fracturing, and that is mimicking the effect of having multiple fracture strands, which increases the fracture surface area, which increases leak off. But then, inspired again by observations from core-through studies, most of those fracture strands do not remain propped, and they don't seem to contribute to production. So that's why that permeability goes back down. And we find that's important because it's how we have to do it to match data. So if you assume that there's not any enhanced leak off, then in many situations, not always, but in many situations, you would find that you would greatly mismatch on the flow back. You would find that the crack doesn't close quickly enough, and you get way too much water when you flow back. But conversely, if you make the permeability high the whole time, then you'll end up with very strange production simulation results that deviate dramatically from the permeabilities that you estimate from a DFIT, that don't make sense with respect to the RTA, et cetera. So having a higher effective permeability to leak off during fracturing than during production is something that I firmly believe needs to be done to match data, and I think it has physical basis in the idea that there are unpropped fractures that contribute to leak off. All right, and then they close and they don't contribute to production. Now, conversely, if you want to make that table irreversible, and also I'll note that you can do both. You can have it both irreversible and reversible. So if you make it irreversible, then what happens is as fluid leaks off, the permeability goes up and stays up. But now you get into one more wrinkle there, which is you really need to be doing that with a dual porosity model. So you guys are probably familiar with the dual porosity model. Every rectangular element in the matrix would actually be two elements. One of them is the quote fracture element that represents the fluid in fractures in that volume of rock, and then the other is a matrix element that represents fluid in the matrix of that volume of rock. So we're doing a dual porosity in addition to have these discrete hydraulic fractures or even discrete natural fractures that you can specify. So there's discrete fractures as well as now you can use a dual porosity option in ResFrac. So the reason that's important is because if we go to this topic of leak off, the fluid leaks off into the quote fracture elements surrounding the hydraulic fractures. They have much, much lower pore volume than the matrix does, right? And so, the question was asking, well, it seems like there's a mesh dependence because, the amount of fluid that leaks off, the average fluid pressure of the matrix element will depend on, its size. It's an exactly correct point. I agree with the question exactly. But that's why what I would actually recommend is using a dual porosity model. So in that situation, the fracture element pore volume is so small that you're going to have fluid flowing across multiple matrix, or rather multiple fracture elements, multiple dual porosity fracture elements. So it creates kind of a broader region of pressure perturbation That's the main point. When you use dual porosity, the region around the hydraulic fractures that has enhanced pressure increases in size. It gets broader. And so then you're going to kind of defeat that mesh dependence, because you're not just leaking off into one element anymore, but you're leaking off into a lot of elements. Now, there's still some potential for mesh dependence. So I mean, certainly, if you're trying to capture, you think SRVs are 10 feet wide, then you need to have fractures you need to make sure your elements are at least 10 feet wide, right? So you may want to refine a mesh if that was the approach that you were using, in addition to using a dual porosity for the leak off. So to recap, the way you would describe the SRV is you would make everything dual porosity. So as fluid leaks off from the hydraulic fractures, it pressurizes the fracture dual porosity elements. That creates an irreversible permeability enhancement. Because it's dual porosity, the pressure perturbation will spread much further away from the fractures. And that's why it won't be mesh dependent anymore, or it'll have a lot less mesh dependence, because you're leaking off now not in one element, but in many elements. And then you've effectively created a region of enhanced permeability around the fractures. So I hope that that's a long answer. So you can do it. And if you have any questions or want to talk through that, let me know. But I personally don't recommend it, but I certainly, we don't know everything. So maybe there's situations where it seems like the right approach, and certainly we support that if people want to do it that way. The other little detail I was going to add is when you do these, I'm going to go back to a previous topic. When you have fluid leaking off from the fracture element into the matrix element, and you have a pressure-dependent multiplier, it uses the pressure of the fracture element to select the multiplier. So let's say that the matrix element has a pressure of 4,000 psi, and the fracture element has a pressure of 6,000 psi. Well, we are going to assume that below the scale of the model, there's a region near the fracture, very near the fracture, like within inches of the fracture, that has enhanced pressure and permeability. And that's why when you do the leak-off calculation, when ResFrac does the leak-off calculation, it uses the pressure in the fracture to calculate the permeability multiplier. But that applies only to the reversible. It only applies to the reversible fracture to matrix element calculation, not the irreversible. So again, for the irreversibles, you'd want to use dual porosity so that you are in fact pressurizing a broader region of the rock. All right, long answer, but complex question, so it deserves a lot of answers.
So I kind of clicked through in the background as Mark was speaking, but to quickly recap, to implement that, if you should choose, again, we haven't found it necessary in the consulting work that we've done for clients, but if you wanted to experiment with it, under the startup panel, you'll see an option for dual porosity. You would select dual porosity, probably PSS is the recommended one to use. Then under startup or static model and initial conditions, you'll see that table has expanded to include new columns that weren't there previously. Amongst those columns, there is a Boolean called dual porosity, where you can select particular layers to make dual porosity. And then you'll have to put in 4 new values, which is the dual porosity fracture porosity compressibility, the fracture porosity, the shape factor, and then the matrix, the dual porosity matrix element permeability. And then the third and final component is under curve sets. If you expand curve sets and scroll down, we typically and by default recommend using a reversible pressure dependent permeability. And that's to mimic the effect of multiple fracture strands and accelerated leak off. But if you were doing the dual porosity and you wanted that SRV region, you would then also select the irreversible pressure dependent permeability table, and you would then be able to create one. And this is entered with as a delta from original pressure. And so this table is showing at a delta of 1500 psi above original. I would apply a permeability multiplier of 3 to the original permeability. So that is the 90-second version of how to implement what Mark just described.
Thank you, Mark and Garrett. I'm glad you understand my question. That's exactly what I was asking. Thank you.
Oh, 1 for 15, not a bad record.
Well, I'll just I got a nice text from somebody who made a good point. There's two types of dual porosity, pseudo-steady state and transient. And probably in a very low permeability formation like this, transient is the correct option to select. Pseudo-steady state is simpler. It's much easier to implement in the simulator. The fluid exchange between the fracture element and the matrix element in the dual porosity is simply proportional to the pressure difference with a constant of proportionality. But in reality, it would be something more like linear flow, in which a pressure gradient develops inside the matrix and the leak-off rate changes, or the production rate changes over time in a dynamic way. And that's what the transient model captures. And that's much more complicated to implement in ResFrac, but it is implemented. We use a semi-analytic technique. And if you refer to the technical write-up, it gives the reference on how we do that.
Yeah, and this is Joe. You know, back in the early 90s when we were building our first finite difference model to handle a shale and put in dual porosity, at the time, coal bed methane was using a lot of pseudo steady state options. And because the cleats are so small, 1/4 inch or maybe, you know, a 1/2 inch at most, you get into pseudo steady state pretty quickly. But in the shales, the natural fractures are typically, you know, I'd say at best 4 feet apart maybe, or if they're 8 feet or 10 feet or 30 feet. And so the transient solution was a much better way to history match long-term data. I mean, we had production data from old shale wells in Appalachia that were 50 to 100 years old. And so we had kind of honed in on the transient. Yeah, so Mark, anyway, that's a little bit of history there.
I'm glad that you appreciate that, because it took me quite a while to implement it in ResFrac.
We won't ask you to make a graph of time spent on feature versus how popular or used feature is.
You know, there are a few things I spend a lot of time on that never get used, sadly, but otherwise I've been pretty efficient.
I think largely it's probably a positive correlation, but there's probably some outliers that would cause you to tear out your hair.
Another big myth is that you can do a full 3-phase drainage imbibition relative permeability treatment using, you know, kilo and land and you know, the kind of best practices, and you know, that never gets used. It's too bad, because it took quite a while, like weeks. Anyway, pity.
Someday, somewhere, there will be a project in which we use that.
Yeah, I hope so.
If anyone's curious, when you click curve set under the name, you can then you have a choice of various implementations to choose. Under user defined is where you can define a drainage and imbibition curve for every phase, if you were so enthusiastic to do so. Well, we only have 4 minutes left in the hour, so pause for a minute or two to see if anyone has questions. Otherwise, we may wrap up for the day. All right, well, I did not see any new questions coming in. So, as always, thank you guys for joining. We will convene again next week. Well, thank you guys for the applause. It's appreciated. Although it's probably from Mark, so I won't quite get to the extent of patting myself on the back yet.
No, they took away the applause things when you said my name. I think they were applauding for you, dude.
Well, Joe just gave a thumbs up when they did that, so you can read into it what you will.
Brian's applause is agreeing that he was applauding for Garrett.
The thumbs up was to your performance, Garrett.
Well,
yeah, nice job, thanks, Garrett.
And next week, I'm expecting an update on the milk mile, Joe. So.
Well, how about we do it instead of with milk with another beverage?
Well, so 1 gallon is 128 ounces. The beer mile is 4 beers, which would be 48. So it's still a pretty big delta. You're only drinking 30% of what you would if you did the milk mile.
Garrett, when I was living in Austin working at UT, the World Championship Beer Mile was held in Austin. And I actually attended and saw the guy miss the world record by about 3 seconds. It was pretty awesome.
What time of year was that?
Oh, I don't remember the date.
Well, it just seems like Austin, but like you don't try to break a running record in Austin in the summer.
Yeah, I doubt it was July. You know, it was the evening. Maybe it was the spring. I don't remember. It's pretty great. They did it at the racetrack. The guys were incredible. I mean, there was actually a bronze medalist, an Olympic bronze medalist there, and he didn't win.
Oh yeah, I mean it's a particular skill set that takes a wide expertise.
It was fascinating.
I'll have to look up what my teammate. I don't know if you were on the beginning of the call, but we used to do it every year with the triathlon team, and there was 2 of my teammates that were quite proficient in it. They were probably like on a single mile all out without drinking, they were probably in the high 4s.
Wow.
And so they could do it in like, I think one year Andrew did it in like 5:16 or something like that for the beer mile, which I mean the world record's like 4:15 or something. It's absolutely ridiculous. But I also don't know what the optimal altitude for running is, because there's actually for cycling there's a trade-off between air resistance, which is lower at altitude, versus lung capacity and oxygen content. So it turns out that the best elevation to break cycling records is 6,000 feet, because air resistance is actually lower. But I don't think you're running fast enough when you're running. You're not moving fast enough when you're running for the reduced air resistance to pay off for the oxygen debt as you go higher. But I don't know that. Someone can look that up. Maybe that'll be the fun fact next week, is what the optimal running altitude for speed is. Okay, well, people can tune in next week for either ResFrac and or conversation on obscure physical challenges.
All right, thanks, Garrett. Bye.
Thank you.
So, thanks, Garrett.